What's up friends, Dan Vega here, back with another tutorial, and today we're talking about testing in Spring Boot. So I don't know about you, but I find it extremely frustrating to write tests in Spring. Now this has nothing to do with Spring Framework or Spring Boot because I think they actually provide really great testing support out of the box. For me, this is a couple things. There are so many different types of tests that you can write. So you have unit tests, integration, full integration tests versus slices, which we'll look at today, end-to-end integrations. Then not to mention you have different versions of JUnit you have to be compatible with, JUnit 4, JUnit 5, and then annotations. Annotations really make our life easy, but for me it seems like they're always changing. Like some get combined into others, some work with JUnit 4, some work with JUnit 5. And again, I think a lot of this comes with when you go to search for something, you find like, hey, how do I do this specific test? You're going to find a whole ton of content. Not all of it is always up to date. And so that can be make things a little hard. So today what I want to do is actually write a simple test class to test a JDBC template CRUD operations. Now, why are we doing that? I'll go ahead and link to it below and you can find a card up here. But I previously released a video on how to use the JDBC template and basically how to write CRUD operations there. And I wanted to start off with the tests, but I thought it would be a little confusing to start there. So I started with the CRUD operations and I want to come back and actually test those. So that is what we are going to do today, and we will do it right after this. Before we get started, this video is sponsored by me. If you're new to the channel, head over to danvega.dev and learn a little bit more about me. One way you can support the channel is through my content. So I have free content on here. You can look through articles and videos. I have some paid content in the form of courses. And one thing, if you are feeling like you want to go ahead and help out, one thing I'm really looking for is ideas on what types of videos that you'd like to see. Are there any videos or tutorials that you'd like to see me go through? This can be on a variety of topics. You can request anything. I may go ahead and reply to you and say, sorry, I don't write code in C or C++. I can't give you a tutorial on that, but if it's something I know, I'd be happy to put something together. So just fill out this contact form until I get a little bit better of a process in place to take those requests. This is probably the best place to do that. So again, learn a little bit more about me over at danvega.dev. And with that, let's get into today's tutorial. Okay, so normally I start by creating a new project. I really like to start from the beginning, but as I mentioned in the open, this is actually going to be a continuation of a project that I worked on in a previous video. So if you haven't watched that and you're really interested in seeing that, I would pause this video and go watch that first. Again, the link for that video will be in the description below. But I wanted a way for us to go ahead and work on this together. So I've created a new Git repository here at github.com/danvega/data-jdbc-test. And this one actually has two branches. The master branch, if you just clone the repository as is, and we'll do that together, you're going to get the starting code. Then there is a completed branch, and the completed branch will have the finished tests that we're going to write today. So just a heads up on that. So what you can do is actually copy this URL, and we're going to take this over into IntelliJ. Now you can use whatever method you'd like to go ahead and clone this repository. If you want to jump on a command line, if you want to use whatever software you enjoy using for this, that is fine. I just know that not a lot of people, I don't know if a lot of people know that you can just import a Git repository using IntelliJ, which I'm a huge fan of if you've watched any of my previous videos. So let's head over to IntelliJ and we'll do that. All right, so here we are in IntelliJ, and instead of creating a new project or opening an existing project, I'm going to do a git from version control. So I'm going to go ahead and put the URL in here, and this is the URL of that repository that will be in the description below as well. And then you give it a directory of where you want to save this to. So I have a boot directory. I'm going to create it with the same name as the repository, and we're just going to go ahead and hit clone. All right, so once that is done, it will open up in IntelliJ and it will open the README, I believe. And here I am in project. I'm just going to go down to source, main, Java, and the main package. Again, I'm just going to run through this code quickly. I'm kind of assuming that you at least took a look at the code first or watched the previous video. But basically, we have a simple application with a simple domain model of a course. A course has an ID, a title, a description, and a link. The DAO layer has an interface that all DAOs should abide by, which basically gives us some CRUD operations and a list. And so our course JDBC DAO will implement that DAO interface. And we get a JDBC template in here, and we're using the JDBC template to just write some straight SQL queries to get information out of and into a database. As well as, if you look under resources, you will see an application.properties, and there is a data source for course platform. There is a generate unique name equals false. If you haven't, I've released a video on that as well. That is causing a lot of people some confusion on the data source name getting generated. So I'll go ahead and link to that video as well. And then the Spring 2 console is enabled. So we are using an H2 database here. For this purposes, it really wouldn't matter. You can use whatever database, because on the test side, we're going to use an H2 database. But I'll show you how we kind of take care of that. So I'm going to close all of this out, and I am going to go into test. And under here, there is just a single test, which doesn't really do anything. This is the one that's generated with your Spring Boot application. And the first thing I'm going to do is create a new package. So I'm going to say new package, and we're going to call this DAO. So we want the tests that we're writing in the same package structure that they are in our source. This just makes for easier testing when it comes to access control to different classes. So I like to follow this pattern. So here what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to say new and Java class, and we're going to call this our course DAO test. Okay, before I jump in and start writing the code for this test, it really is a good idea to have a plan as to what type of test you're going to write here. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, it can be confusing at times, like which test should I write, a unit test, an integration test, etc. So I'm going to give you my thought process on this, and this is by no means gold standard. This is what you should do. This is my opinion. Please feel free to have your own. I would love to hear yours, because again, testing is one of those things I'm not great at. I like to try and get better at this. So if you have comments on that, please leave them below. I'd love to start some discussions around this. So for me, a unit test in this case doesn't make a lot of sense, and I'll tell you why. Because if I go into the course JDBC DAO, if I were to write a unit test here, one of the things that I'm going to mock out, because again, in a unit test, you're simply testing a controllable unit. And that unit in this case would be the course JDBC DAO. So anything else is going to be considered a dependency, which you want to mock out. So in this case, I would mock out the JDBC template, right? Because that is a dependency. So what I'm left with then is basically mocking that out and saying, hey, when you query something and it takes these two arguments, here's what I'm going to return to you. And for me, that doesn't do me anything. That doesn't do me any good. And I've always kind of been the mindset of when I'm unit testing something, I'm unit testing something lower level that I've written. In this case, the JDBC template is something some really smart people have written. So I don't need to, I'm not testing that, but two, I don't need to mock that out. I get that it's a dependency, but to me, these tests become pretty dumb and pointless for me if I'm mocking that out. So for me, I want to write an integration test here. I want to know that, hey, this SQL is working. I want to know that I'm hitting the database and the SQL that I've written is correct, and that when I ask for all the rows in the database, that works. So for me, an integration test makes much more sense here. Now I get the point of a unit test. The unit test is to be able to not have like this, you want something fast and responsive. So I get that. And that's why what we're going to do today here in the course DAO test is pretty cool, because it's going to be a slice test. And this slice test is not a full integration test. And what that allows us to do is run this very quickly and get some immediate feedback. So with that, sorry for the little bit of a side tangent. I just wanted to kind of cover that. So we're going to start with the annotation. So the annotation that we're going to cover today is Data JDBCTest. And so what I want to do is actually hop into this source code and take a look at what this does. So this annotation can be used for a Data JDBC test that focuses only on Data JDBC components. Using this annotation will disable full auto configuration and instead only apply configuration relevant to Data JDBC tests. So what this means to you is that this is not a full integration test. It is not going to load up every component that your application uses. It's not scanning the entire class path and loading up everything. It is only loading what is relevant to this test. One of those things is going to be a JDBC template because that is relevant to this test. So it'll wire that up for us. Another thing is by default, tests annotated with Data JDBCTest are transactional and roll back at the end of each test. So they also use an embedded in-memory database, replacing any explicit or auto-configured data source. So this is really cool. So if we have a MySQL, Postgres, MS SQL server, whatever, as our dev database, this test is going to use an in-memory database, and this is also going to speed things up considerably. Finally, if you're looking to load your full auto application configuration but want to use a database, you should consider Spring Boot test instead. So this is just a long-winded way of saying I wanted to dive in here and say this can be very quick. So the tests that we write today are kind of like unit tests because in a unit test, they're very fast. And this is what's called a slice test. We're just testing a slice of our application. We're not full integration testing our entire application. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing that we're going to need is a JDBC template because that is what we are going to be testing. So we're going to use a JDBC template and we're actually going to get that in our constructor. And so Spring is going to wire that up for us as long as we tell it to. So we're going to say at autowired here. The next thing we want to do is we want to get an instance of our course JDBC DAO. So we're going to say course JDBC DAO, and then we'll call that DAO. And then here in our constructor, we'll go ahead and say DAO is equal to new course JDBC DAO, right? So we're just going to wire that up and pass in our JDBC template. So now we have an instance of our DAO, which is really doing all of the work, right? So if we go back to DAO, we have a list method, we have a create, we have get, all of our basic CRUD operations. So those are the things that we're going to test. So let's go ahead and write our first test. So we're going to write a test and we're going to say public void list courses should, if I can spell, return all courses. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to expect a list of courses called courses, and we're going to use that DAO and call list. Let's go ahead and import. So we're going to use assert equals, and I'm not quite sure why that is not. So this is going to come from import static org.junit.jupyter.api.assertions. There we go. .star. So I don't know why that wasn't coming in. So what we want to do here is we want to compare the number of courses. So what we should be getting back is 5 to the number of courses that we're getting back. So the way that you can look at this is if you go into data.sql, you'll see that we configure 5 courses when the application loads up. So now what we can do is go ahead and run these tests. So let's go ahead and run course DAO test, and we'll look at a few things here. Okay, so first off, the past, so that's good. But let's look down in here. If we look in here, we can see that we started an embedded database at JDBC URL mem and then this long number. So remember back when we were looking at application.properties, even though we configured a data source name and we told it not to generate a unique name, that is only for the our standard run, not our test side of things. So when we use this annotation, it will go ahead and configure this random data source name for us. That's part of what it does. So it starts up this embedded database with a random name. Then you will see that it begins a transaction here. So it does something, and then right here after that, it goes ahead and rolls back that transaction. Now we didn't insert anything, so we don't actually have to undo anything, but you'll see it starts a transaction and it rolls it back. And this is going to be key when we're starting to like insert data and update data and delete data. We're not actually messing with any of the data in our database. This is going to all be rolled back for us, which is really, really cool. So let's just go ahead and start to fill out some of our other methods here. So I'm going to add another test, and we're going to, let's say, public void get course with valid ID should return empty, invalid. So the first one we want to do is an invalid ID. So that should return an empty optional. If you're with me when we wrote this out, when we wrote the DAO, that is actually going to return an optional course. So if you pass in an invalid ID like 99, then we should get an empty optional back, not a null scenario, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say optional course is equal to DAO.get and basically what I want to make sure of is that we assert false course.is present. So that is that one, and now I'm just going to copy this one and we'll do a valid test as well. So get course with valid ID should return course. So if we get 1, which is a valid course, we want to assert true that the course is present. So that will work. So let's go ahead and run these tests again. All right, so far so good. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is actually just instead, I'm sure you guys don't want to watch me type all these out. I'm going to copy and paste in a few of these tests, and then we'll talk about them. Okay, so we have our list, which returns all. We have our get that returns 1, and we have an invalid ID, which returns none. Now the next one we'll write is a valid course should be created. So a valid course, in this case, I don't think we have any, update course. So in this case, we don't have any actual validation on it, but I left this open so that if you wanted to add validation to the course model, you could. And then another good test would be, hey, an invalid course doesn't get created. But in this case, we don't really do any validation, so it should be created no matter what. But what I'm doing is course equals new course. I'm giving it a title, description, and a link because the ID is created in the database. We call create. And then we're going to reread from the database again. We're going to ask it, because remember, this is transactional in the method, not after each call, right? So this whole thing is wrapped in a transaction. So when we insert it, now if we go to list it again, we should have six courses in there. And if we go ahead and get that one, we should have the appropriate title, description, and link. Update a course, again, same kind of thing. We're going to get one of them. We're going to change the title. We're going to call update in our DAO, and then we're going to reread that from the database and make sure that the title actually did get updated. Finally, delete course. Hey, we're going to call delete. We're going to get a list of courses, and now we should only have 4. Because again, even if we added one earlier, that rolled back after that test. And so at this point, when this test starts, we should still have 5 records in there. So let's go ahead and see if this works, and we'll go ahead and run them. All right, and all 6 tests passed. So again, you can grab the final code for this on the same repository in the completed branch, and that should have everything that we did here today. So as I said when we started this video, testing can be a little bit confusing because of the number of different types of tests you have to write and the evolution of testing in the Spring framework throughout the years and all the different examples that you're going to find online. So I'm curious as to know what you guys think. Please go ahead and leave your comments below. 1, did this actually help you out? 2, do you have any good sources for testing? Because I can't be the only one that runs into this. And like I said, it's one thing that I'm really trying to get better at. So I hope this helped. If it did, please go ahead and leave me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and as always, friends, happy coding.